and I did my senior thesis on fertility rates in Cameroon. Fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa remain high. In fact, there was just an opinion piece in the New York Times about the benefits of lowering fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa. I wanted to look at the geographic patterns of fertility rates in Cameroon. I wanted to know if there were areas where women had more children or fewer children. And I wanted to know what effect of where you live would have on your fertility decisions. I was really looking at fertility in the context of diffusion. Diffusion is the idea that we spread ideas and information through social interaction. And we tend to interact with the people we live near the most. I used data from the 2011 Demographic and Health Survey for Cameroon, and I used GIS and spatial modeling to look for spatial clustering of fertility rates. I also made regression models to determine which characteristics of a woman and of her community would have the strongest effects on her fertility. My results showed an interesting relationship between infrastructure, development, and fertility. Fertility rates were highest in northern Cameroon, which tends to be more rural and have less infrastructure, while the rates were lowest in the southern and coastal areas, particularly around large cities. I also found that a woman with more education, more access to the media, and more relative wealth tends to have lower fertility. A woman's community also has an effect on her fertility, specifically the wealth of her community. And this further justifies the study of the relationship between infrastructure, development, and fertility.
Hi, I'm Emma Brandt, and my senior thesis is about Balinese dance and religion under the influence of tourism and globalization. On the Indonesian island of Bali, Hindu communities use various kinds of performance, such as traditional dance and puppet shows in religious ceremonies. In turn, performers often view their art as religious, as an offering to God. Successful performers can receive taksu, a mix of divine inspiration and stage presence that makes a show more appealing and signifies the favor of the gods. However, tourism has affected these performances, as foreign visitors often want not only to see dance performances, but to attend religious ceremonies. I interviewed dancers, puppeteers, and priests while attending performances and studying dance in order to discover how this contradiction between public, secular performances and religious, non-commercial performances was being resolved. I found that Balinese dancers protected their sacred work by defining a community of Balinese tradition from which they sought to exclude tourist influences, although they appreciated the economic benefits of tourism. They displayed extraordinary adaptability in delivering to the tourists the authentic experience they craved while keeping more religious aspects separate. However, the division between sacred and secular performances was controversial, and many of those I spoke to worried about this. This illustrates some of the problems with commodifying culture for a global market, and illustrates one node in the web of communities struggling to make globalization work for them.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashlyn, and my thesis investigates if Rhode Island's elderly population lives in walkable neighborhoods. Walkability has two components. The first is the ability to walk to basic amenities like banks or markets within 5 minutes. The second component is street safety, which includes things like clear signage and snow clearance. I found that a majority of Rhode Island's elderly population does not live in a walkable neighborhood. This is concerning because once people lose their ability to drive, they will lose their independence if they cannot do basic errands by foot. I hope my research sparks an interest in developing walkable communities so that the elderly can age comfortably in their own homes for as long as they choose, instead of their neighborhoods choosing for them.
Hi, I'm Gwendolyn Rogers. I'm from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and while that's 10 minutes away geographically, culturally it feels a world away from Brown in many ways. And this phenomenon has kind of inspired my academic pursuits at Brown and ultimately led to my senior thesis entitled Enriched Perspectives, How Brown Undergrads Navigate Campus Culture Based on Their Social Class. So a lot of this came about because I feel as though Brown always asks its students to be very thoughtful about the world in which they live, but I wasn't really feeling as if Brown was thoughtful about the world that I came from. And I saw a disconnect between a narrative on campus of inclusivity and a feeling as if my background wasn't necessarily accepted. So I wanted to set out and look at the ways in which the playing field looks different for people of different social class backgrounds, and to what extent people from lower class backgrounds even wanted to play by the same rules or the same game. I did this through qualitative research methods. I conducted 17 interviews, 9 from upper class students and 8 cases of lower class students, and kind of put those stories in conversation with one another to have a comparative look at what this looks like. And this illuminated 4 main themes within my research. The first one was just how class differences manifest themselves on campus generally. The second was how Brown student identity intersects with other identities. The third was how people find spaces and create networks on campus. And the fourth took a look at post-Brown plans and ideas of social mobility. And I found that these findings were really significant because in many ways they illuminated surprising findings. The mainstream ideas and assumptions about social class were often misguided, and mainstream resources were often inadequate according to my lower class students, and I think it's really important for Brown to consider that as it's engaging with different types of people from different backgrounds. And this also took a look at social class in a way that doesn't consider lower class backgrounds inherently disadvantaged, but really considers the way in which an elite culture constructs this disadvantage. So I think it's important to validate all different class backgrounds, and I hope my thesis kind of gets people thinking in that direction, and that people who read it are really critical about the ways they engage with people from all different backgrounds.
Hi, my name is Larry Al, and for the past year I've been working on my thesis, Protests in Public in Post-Colonial Hong Kong, Contentious Politics, Social Mobilizations, and Identity Formation, from 2003 to 2013. The thesis looks at a decade of protests in the city that began in 2003 and focuses on 4 cases. In 2006, over the conservation of a pier in Hong Kong. In 2010, over protests over a high-speed railroad linking Hong Kong to the rest of China. In 2012, over the introduction of national education in the city. And in 2013, actually last November, over the decision by the government to reject a television station license by HKTV. The thesis uses a lot of methods, ranging from actual ethnography to visual methods to content and discourse analysis of newspaper reports. And a lot of it relies on 25 interviews that I conducted over the winter break, with movement organizers and participants, and basically looking at how they view these events as being connected. And with them, I was able to think aloud and synthesize my thoughts in them. So the protests, even though they're about a wide variety of issues, have 3 commonalities in the discourses that they produce. First, concerning economic justice in the city. The second, on democratic accountability. And I look at how these 2 components work together to form a new articulation of Hong Kong identity that's based on civic nationalism, not so much on ethnic pride and Chineseness. And basically, the thesis challenges the assumption that with the return of return of Hong Kong to China, there comes a bit social and cultural integration. And through these events, you can see that there isn't a single Hong Kong identity that's being articulated, and that there is a process of contestation between the different parties involved.
Hi, my name is Audrey Davis, and my senior thesis looked at 4 cities in Rhode Island and how they've been faring throughout this wave of urban fiscal crisis. So the 4 cities I looked at were Central Falls, East Providence, Providence, and Woonsocket, and I did case studies on these 4 cities, following them from before the recession hit, during the recession, and to this year. And so I was mainly looking to see to what extent these cities' problems were caused by internal factors, like local politics and budget problems, as opposed to external factors that were outside their control, like the economic downturn in general and kind of the role the state of Rhode Island played in these cities' finances. And I actually found out that while internally these cities had been struggling for years and they were predisposed to crisis, that the economic downturn and the role of the state of Rhode Island kind of pushed them over the edge this time around. And so it wasn't entirely the fault of the cities that they were struggling so much. And so I mostly focused, once I found out that Rhode Island played such a big role in these cities' finances, I kind of looked at city-state relations between these cities in the state of Rhode Island to see how those were different city by city. And I found that Providence actually was able to avoid state oversight and the stigma of that because of its close relationship as the capital city to the state of Rhode Island, whereas the other 3 cities, although they were struggling just as much as Providence, the state ultimately intervened into their finances. And so when the state does intervene like that, it takes away control from the democratically elected officials within those cities, which is a huge problem when communities rely on those cities' leaders for services. And so I guess the main takeaways for this thesis would be that city leaders and cities themselves must be held accountable when a crisis like this hits, because the idea of urban fiscal crisis is not new at all, and problems like this will persist down the road if city leaders aren't held accountable.
Why can't talking about death be cool? Research has found that roughly 73% of Americans would prefer to die at home, but roughly the same percentage actually die in hospital settings. Instead of being viewed as a privilege, death is feared in our society, especially among college-age students, aka Generation Y, because we often believe that death happens at an old age, which is unfortunately not the truth. My sociology capstone project focuses on making this conversation more comfortable among Generation Y, in hopes that their interest and feedback can prompt a greater and cooler conversation movement. I conducted a total of 15 in-person interviews asking Brown students 8 questions pertaining to the barriers and stigmatization around this topic. My research found an overwhelming desire to die with a few, if not all, of these wishes. At an old age, painlessly, comfortably, happily, in their sleep, at home, and surrounded by family and friends. Additionally, respondents agreed that the major barriers to having this type of conversation were feelings of discomfort, anxiety, fear, unease, and awkwardness. Occupation played a role in my findings. Some of my interviewees were student veterans, and they have tended to have more of these conversations regarding their end-of-life wishes in terms of their do not resuscitate, do not intubate statuses than their counterparts. Finally, respondents acknowledged that at this age, they should ideally have written a living will, appointed a medical power of attorney, and have thought deeper about how long and through what means they would want to be kept alive before they became a burden to their families or until all hope was gone if they were put in an unfortunate health condition. I believe such responses were not a result of providing socially acceptable answers, but rather a matter of not being prompted at this age to talk about this. So, with this in mind, I have applied the information gathered from my interviews to the use of Twitter to publicize personalized memes as well as retweet relevant articles in order to entice Generation Yers to comfortably and proudly have end-of-life conversations with their family, friends, and even themselves. At the very least, I hope my efforts have generated a few laughs upon viewing, but I truly hope that they have prompted my generation to think deeper about this topic and realize that it is crucial and #SoCool to talk about.
My name is Michael Ling. I wrote my senior honor thesis on Chinese racism, in which I looked at how people in mainland China perceive and interact with non-Chinese races. This is, in fact, a very understudied topic. First of all, racial discussions in the West are traditionally constructed on American or European context, and since China is not a multiracial country, racism is generally considered not a Chinese issue. And second, for Chinese themselves, they're very aware of their past being victim of racism. However, their victimized history and experience tend to blind themselves from realizing their own racist attitudes and behavior. So the first thing I did in my thesis is to prove that Chinese racism actually exists. I did this by drawing evidence from the 19th century all the way to today and demonstrated that Chinese racism not only exists, but it's been around for over a century now. And I then presented my observations from the interviews I did back in China over the winter. And also I discussed the implications of these observations. Among other things, I argued that Chinese racism, although it's originally imported ideology from the West, it is in fact only a partial import in the sense that first, China doesn't have the social foundation for racism, so that results in only the superficial copying of the racist idea in the West. And second, Chinese racism is very often bundled with Sinocentrism and Chinese xenophobia, which leads Chinese racism to be very different from the original idea in the West. Overall, I did two things in my thesis. First, I add to the currently very limited understanding of Chinese racism, and second, by demonstrating the relevance and presence of Chinese racism, I urge more sociologists to look into this issue.
Hi, my name is Emma Rodbro, and I did my senior capstone project on senior citizens with memory impairment and how to improve their quality of life. I think it's a really important topic considering how much memory impairment is growing in this country. More and more people are getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia, and I think it's extremely important for people to understand how these people with these diagnoses can live the best lives that they can. So I did this in 2 parts. My first part of my research was by volunteering weekly at 2 different facilities. The first is the Village at Waterman Lake, which is a nursing home in Rhode Island that really specializes in memory impairment. And the second was at a senior center. The program was called Memory Tree, and it was a weekly program where people with early onset Alzheimer's would come in and participate in activities. Both of these things included music therapy, yoga, word games, things like that. And I really just wanted to see how the staff interacted with the seniors, what sort of strategies they used, what worked, what didn't. After that, the second part of my research was interview-based. So I interviewed the staff at both of these places, as well as some social workers, on what sort of things work with memory impaired seniors, how to treat them when they have a memory lapse and things like that. And then the last part, I interviewed family members of people who had relatives with memory impairment and how it affected them, how they treated them, how their relationship changed since the diagnosis, things like that. And basically I concluded at the end of it all that what really works and improves the quality of life among seniors with Alzheimer's and dementia is to help them keep their independence and dignity. So it's really important that they participate in the things they always used to, keep doing the things they love, keep social interactions and things like that. I really enjoyed my project. I think it's really important, and there's not a lot of research being done on it yet, and I hope that I can continue in this field even after Brown.
I'm Ralitza Dekova, and I'm in the Bachelor of Science program here in the Sociology department. My thesis was entitled Immunization Status of Children Under 5 in Swaziland. Swaziland is where I grew up, and this is one of the things that led me to pursue a thesis with focus on Swaziland. It's a lower middle income country, and it's got quite a high poverty rate, and public health interventions are quite important for the country, especially immunization, which is the second most important public health intervention after the provision of clean water. So I used the Demographic and Health Survey conducted in 2006. It's nationally representative, and one of the things that I found was that the only reason for which a child is less likely to be vaccinated is if it doesn't live with its mother. It was a small subset of the population, but it was a significant finding, and the only other finding was that age is something that leads a child to be less likely to be vaccinated, which was quite expected. So this is a good finding. It means that going forward, what needs to be focused on is an evaluation of the programs through which children are getting vaccinated. Are the local clinics doing a good job at immunizing the children under 5? The measles campaign, what are the shortcomings and how can it be made better? So all in all, it was good findings, and they are positive findings to go forward.